5 to 16, you don't see him there?
Hi, and welcome back to our latest episode of On the Job with PORAC podcast. I'm Brian Marvel, president of PORAC, with PORAC Vice President Damon Kurtz sitting alongside me. For the second episode of our fifth season, we've decided to bring on Paul Mitchell and Evan McLaughlin of the Redistricting Partners here in Sacramento via Zoom. Before we start with them, PORAC hired their firm, and they've been monitoring the redistricting process for us and have been reporting to the board of directors and the executive committee as we watched this interesting process happen every 10 years. And it's been really interesting. This question is more for Paul, but you know, on Twitter, I see you on Twitter, and we get a lot of folks on there complaining about the redistricting, but it really does seem like California has probably got one of the best processes in the state. What are your thoughts on that compared to other states in the union?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to measure what is the best process. And I think it's fair for people to debate on Twitter. You know, somebody like me might be saying, hey, from a redistricting perspective, the commission process is the best process because it allows for the redistricting to be done based on communities of interest and what the data says and what the law is, rather than having districts that are distorted by politics or, you know, legislative horse trading. You vote for this bill, I'll give you this district, or keeping incumbents in their seats and all these other things that happen when the legislature draws their own lines. Now, it's legitimate, I think, for people to say, well, I really wish the legislature would draw the lines because, you know, nationally, Republicans are able to get all these Republican seats in these other states. So we think Democrats should be able to draw the lines so that maybe there's 2 Republican members of Congress in the whole state. And that's a legitimate claim that they wish politics were more part of the process. And I'm kind of on the side of saying that I think that districts should be drawn in a way that's more fair and open. I think some of the illegitimate comments that come out are people saying, well, you know, it was done behind closed doors, or there was secret gerrymandering, or there were secret things happening in back rooms. None of that stuff's true. I think that on the face of it, the California process was an ideal process for people that want open, transparent redistricting that's based just on what the data shows and protecting communities of interest and following the Voting Rights Act. But if that's not your style of redistricting or what kind of redistricting you want, then legitimately it's not the political redistricting that they have in other states.
Well, I think some of the complaints come, you know, particularly from folks that are maybe in the Republican Party, and they see that maybe these aren't falling the way they want it to fall or think it should fall or would help them. But the reality is, in this state, we're just predominantly Democrat the voter base. And that shows in the legislature and where we are as a state. And I don't know how you fix that, and I don't think there's a way to fix that through redistricting either. It's literally it is just the reality of what California is.
Yeah, California is much more democratic now than it was even 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the redistricting process done by the commission doesn't try to draw more democratic districts. One way, just thinking of a part of the state that a lot of your members might understand, the Orange County, in the middle of Orange County is this really heavily Latino community around Santa Ana. And if Democrats wanted to come into Orange County and draw maps, they could draw maps where every seat would be a Democratic seat just by splitting up that city of Santa Ana and spreading it out amongst a bunch of districts. This commission didn't do that. And this commission created Republican seats in Orange County, where the Democratic controlled legislature might not. Democrats will still be supermajorities in the legislature in both houses and have a supermajority of the congressional delegation. And Evan can talk a lot more about all those specifics and kind of the things we're seeing in the final maps. So I can understand Republicans being concerned that it seems like they're headed for another decade where the maps are drawn in a way where Republicans aren't going to be able to make big gains. But really, the only way to create a map that would make big gains for Republicans would be gerrymander to try to maximize Republican seats somehow. And even then, Matt Rexroad, who's I think one of the best redistricting experts on the Republican side nationally, and he's a California consultant, he even says that he couldn't draw a map that would bring back Republicans, to kind of parity in the legislature and eliminate those big Democratic majorities, even if he had full control over drawing the maps.
And I think the big issue in that arena is just a competition of ideas. You got to bring ideas that the constituency wants to vote for, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And if you have good ideas and you can get them over the finish line, then you'll be able to win elections. Or at least that's my belief, and I would hope that would be the case. But I understand that may not necessarily be the way it works out all the time. So I guess this is for either you or Evan. So obviously, a lot of it was really interesting to watch the process, some of the map development. Maybe, Evan, you could talk a little bit about how that map development initially started. We had some issues in between there, and then now we've got the final maps. So what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good segue from the last point, which is, just how far either to the left or the right could this commission actually end up drawing these districts. And the truth is that not a lot changed when it came to the partisan breakdown of these maps. The Senate seat, I think the Senate map got maybe a smidge more conservative, went from 36 seats that Biden won in the current map to 35. But the same number of seats that Gavin Newsom won in 2018, same number of seats where Prop 20 outperformed the state average. These are actually a little more progressive than what the commission did for the Senate in the draft maps that came out in November. And remember, there's a whole process. There's been months and months of testimony, even before the census came out, that then led to a bunch of visualizations and a lot of kind of hand-wringing about how this commission wanted the maps to look before they had to produce drafts in November. Then December was all spent revising those based on, nobody really was as involved in the process until they actually had a draft to look at, right? And then you saw all these communities come out and start talking about, we don't want to be with this one, or we should be together, this city and that city. So that's a Senate map. On the Assembly side, we went from 63 seats that Newsom won to 64. And I think that's a good thing for us all to remember. If all the legislative candidates performed just as well as the Democrats, there'd be 64 Democrats in the Assembly, right? And we're right now talking about 60 or 61. And obviously with all the resignations, that's a smaller number right now. But, the legislature tends to have fewer Democratic electeds in the Senate and the Assembly than what, you would see a top of the ticket race like the presidential and the governor's races produce.
So with the current maps, and this could be to Paul too, since from 10 years ago till today, it seemed like there was a lot of current elected officials were drawn into the same districts. Is it just because it's been 10 years and my memory's faded, or is that the reality?
So when we look at the 2011 process, they were starting from a gerrymandered map that the legislature had drawn. It wasn't gerrymandered to be the most Democratic map. It was actually gerrymandered to get votes on the budget. So certain Republicans were given districts that they really wanted and protected in the redistricting process in 2001. And so that old map the legislature drew was being redone by the 2011 commission. It had many more radical changes in it than the transition from 2011 map to now. And also there was a big difference in terms of where we were at in the term limit structure back in 2011 when that map was passed. Remember, when that map was passed, we had that old version of term limits, three terms in the Assembly, 2 terms in the Senate. We had constant turnover happening. And in fact, about 30 members of the legislature were being termed out in 2012. So the 2011 map had different kinds of wiggle room as members were terming out and all this kind of commotion that was happening. In this redistricting cycle, we've had some retirements that were unforeseen, but we had 0 terming out assembly members. The real term out cascade begins in 2024, 2026, or 2022, 24, and 26. I'm sorry, 24, 26, and 28. So in 22, you're going to have all these retirements and the effects of redistricting. 24, you're going to have around 25 members of the assembly terming out and about 10 or a dozen or so senators terming out. And you're going to have the entire legislature be absolutely replaced by 2028. So that change in where we're at in the term limit cycle now, and the fact that the map was being redrawn from a commission drawn plan rather than being redrawn from a legislative gerrymander, means that we don't have as much actual change happening in this plan as we did and we saw last time.
So out of all of the districts that have been redrawn, what do you think is the best district, and what do you think is the and I don't want to say worst, but I'd say the weirdest district? Were there any surprises in the districts?
I think what you saw is really, one of the two probably biggest drivers of why districts changed the most in this map were kind of twofold. One is the Voting Rights Act and how the Central Valley was reconfigured because Section 5 had been thrown out, right? And so you have a situation where, just take the Senate map, for example. There used to be this district that Ana Caballero represents now that goes from Monterey all the way to Modesto. And that was a function of the old Section 5. With that out the door, then they had to treat basically the Central Valley the way they treat the rest of the state when it comes to Latino representation, where there's areas where they make up a majority of the eligible citizens who can vote. So what you saw is, okay, they decided not to do this Monterey to Modesto thing anymore. And that actually created a whole musical chairs that we're all kind of grappling with right now. She was drawn into an odd number district. Remember, the Senate, they also have this thing that has to deal with whether the votes are deferred an additional 2 years from their 4-year term or they're accelerated. So Monterey County is now like a whole district, and it's going to be on a different timeline. So if, Ana Caballero didn't have a seat to run in when she's up for re-election in 2022, she decided to go with the rest of her district over the hills into the Central Valley. Well, that's where Senator Melissa Hurtado lives right now too, right? She's from Sanger. So they drew this district that the new 14th district that includes the Merced parts of the Caballero district, the current Caballero district, and then Fresno County, which is where Hurtado's from. And it's created this situation where both of them are going to run against each other. Both members of the Democratic caucus, both of them have won competitive races for the caucus before, and now they're in sort of an intramural squabble, right? And they're going to be drawn in and running against each other in the June primaries against each other. But that's an example of how this process was really driven by the Voting Rights Act and the changes there. The other piece is the really slow growth or even the loss of population in parts of Los Angeles County. And so you see these areas like in the assembly map, right? There's just not enough assembly members or assembly districts for all the incumbents. And so you started, once you get out of sort of the Voting Rights Act areas that are really locked in, but had some of the lowest growth rates, you got into downtown. And there was a part in the draft maps where you saw, Miguel Santiago and Wendy Carrillo were drawn in the same district. And then, the draft, the commission revised that. And then all of a sudden, whoops, there's, up in the San Fernando Valley, there's 5 members of the assembly, 5 incumbents, but only 4 seats. And that's what's produced, the other kind of big member on member race that's going to come down in this primary, which is Adrien Nazarian and Laura Friedman in sort of a southern San Fernando Valley district race. And so those are kind of the bigger changes of why, people have complaints about what this commission did. And maybe we have our own, but really it is a function of the population growth and the Voting Rights Act. That's why you see the new lines the way you do.
I know, and I think at one time there was one of the district, I think it was going to be like 500 miles long, along the Nevada border. I mean, I don't understand how they could conceptually believe that would represent those communities and that representative.
Well, that's a weird thing in redistricting. And we saw a lot of pushback on Twitter to some of these really large districts. And sometimes I would pipe in and I would say, oh, that's ugly. You know, there was one that they were jokingly calling the ribbon of shame, which went all the way from basically just outside of San Francisco all the way down to SLO, and all along the coast. And that district I didn't like, not necessarily because it was large, but because it had this one arm that went into the richest city in America, Atherton, and basically ensured that that coastal kind of rural-ish district that went all the way down down to SLO would be really dominated by, you know, some high income, high turnout, you know, households. And that's the thing I think that's interesting about this large district debate. There was another one on the eastern side of the state that I think is the one you're referencing, that was all the way like from the Oregon border, all the way down the eastern side through like, you know, Inyo, Mono counties down into San Bernardino. And it was this massive district, hundreds of miles, like impossible to actually get across it like in a day. And in the winter, you couldn't get across it maybe at all without like driving through the Central Valley or, I don't know, flying to Oregon and driving back down. The challenge though, is that the commission has two choices. Do we take these rural communities and we put them in a smaller district geographic footprint where maybe half of their voters are from more urban populations, which really means that a more urban representative will probably get elected there? Or do we take this district and make it massive and pack together all these different, more rural, small county, small city populations where even if they are far apart from each other, at least they are sharing kind of the same issues or having the same concerns. I lived in Independence for a while, which is in Inyo County, and we weren't close to anything. You know, we would travel hours to go play basketball game in, you know, Ridgecrest or up in Mammoth, and you know, nothing was close. And would that community be better represented by a district that hopped over Mount Whitney and went into the Central Valley and grabbed one side of Fresno? I mean, a Fresno representative probably doesn't really care much about Independence, California. And that's the challenge that I think that the commission had is, are they gonna, with those rural parts of the state, how do they draw those districts in a way that will allow those districts to have a rural representative versus how do they draw districts in a way that aren't just going to be mocked on Twitter for being like, you know, a bajillion miles long?
Yeah, it's a legitimate issue. I mean, when you look at it from a more local level, looking at, like, say, a county race or a county issue, a county ballot measure, and you have a lot of rural communities, but the voting base is typically in the metropolitan areas of those counties. So Fresno County, for example, you brought that up. The majority of the voter base is going to be right there in that center of the county in Fresno, Clovis, you know, and the suburbs there. But there's a lot of other communities in there, mountain communities, farming communities, that really don't have that voice because the majority of the voter base is going to be there. And so having that representation can be difficult.
Let the experts at 9/11 Media help you take your associations, communications, and public outreach to the next level. They will work with you to strategize, develop, and deploy your communications for optimal results. 9/11 Media has been PORAC's strategic communications partner since 2010. Their services include websites, social media content, mobile apps, magazines, photography, film, video, and more. Contact them today by visiting 911media.com or call them at 877-DIAL-911. That's 877-342-5911.
Again, back to living in Independence, the number one political issue that I understood, even as a high school student in Independence, was that everybody hated the DWP. But you could end up drawing a district where Inyo County could be represented by an employee of DWP, depending on how you drew it and where that political base was. And so how you draw those rural districts is really an interesting challenge, not just for this commission, but for future commissions. And it's a big challenge in redistricting, is when people live in areas that have sparse population, do you figure out ways to allow them to elect a representative that will have their values? Or do you kind of shove them into a district where they've got this urban center where maybe that urban center has where the newspapers are and where the endorsers are and where the political party structures are and where the money is and where people have the time to run for office. It's a challenge to try to figure those kind of things out.
Well, I'll go ahead and close it up with the last two questions. So is there a drop dead date when these maps are like officially finalized, because anybody who wants to file a lawsuit can file a lawsuit? And then the second part is, are there any current lawsuits happening right now or outstanding to stop this?
There are no current lawsuits. We've heard rumors that there were going to be lawsuits. There were threats of lawsuits. Most of that stuff goes straight to the commission and their legal counsel, and they might have been discussing that in closed session, not on the Zooms. But some of the lawsuits that were thrown out there were kind of ridiculous, and nothing really substantive. Evan is kind of an expert on all the deadlines and when the filing deadline is and all that. But these maps, I think they're going to be staying effective and be used for this election cycle.
Yeah, we would have heard by now. This is going to be moving pretty fast, and the registrars are working now to get their. Remember, they have to go and redo all their election systems based on these new maps, and be in time for the March, when the filing deadline is for these candidates for state office and for Congress.
What's the address? It's We Draw the Lines. Is it .org or .com?
I believe it's wedrawthelines.org, but if you go to the wrong one, it just takes you to another website that gives you the link. So yeah, wedrawthelines.org is the website.
All right. So if you want to check out the new districts throughout the state of California, that's the place to go. I want to thank both Evan and Paul for the great work and work product that you provided PORAC during this process. It was very informational, and I know the emails were coming fast and furious from Evan there the last few weeks. I probably inundated my board of directors and my executive committee with all those emails, but it truly was a fascinating experience to sort of live through this process based on what you were putting out and through the portal that you provided us. So again, I want to thank you for the fantastic work on that. And I don't think I'll be here in 10 years, but hopefully the board will rehire you again for the next one.
Well, we'd love to do it. It was great working with you guys. We really do appreciate you being with us this whole time and working with us throughout this cycle. It was fun to be able to keep you informed with the process, and your membership really did kind of dig into it, which was great to see.
Well, thank you for all joining us on this latest episode of On the Job with PORAC with Paul Mitchell and Evan McLaughlin of the Redistricting Partners. If you haven't already, like and subscribe to this podcast and share us on social media. If you have any topic ideas, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram with your suggestions. As always, we'd like to close this podcast by thanking all our PORAC members and our nation's law enforcement. We hope you stay safe and have a great day. PORAC is California's largest law enforcement organization and the largest statewide association in the nation, representing over 77,000 public safety members since 1953. Our monthly podcasts, as well as past episodes, are available on PORAC.org, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, PORAC's YouTube channel, or where popular podcasts are downloaded. Be sure to follow us on all our social media platforms and tag us with your suggestions for future show topics. To learn more about our organization, visit us at PORAC.org. We are PORAC.